Welcome back to Sci-fi Stories, and thank you for your continued support. Recently, YouTube disabled our channel's monetization, leaving us without the budget to keep operating. If you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our dedicated staff, help them cover their living expenses, and continue creating these stories for you. You can donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on the screen or by clicking the PayPal link in the description or the pinned comment. The signal was supposed to be a gift, a cosmic chorus of enlightenment echoing across the void, promising peace to any species willing to listen. They called it the Harmony. But when Earth's deep space arrays finally stripped away its beautiful exterior, they did not find a song of salvation. They found a mouth, a predatory and parasitic maw, waiting to swallow the galaxy whole, disguised as a symphony. The immense obsidian amphitheater of the Galactic Council was bathed in a sterile, shadowless light that offered no warmth. At the center of the vast chamber stood Barrett Barnes. She was a solitary figure against the towering podiums of the alien delegates, her dark suit a stark contrast to the shimmering ceremonial robes worn by the beings looking down upon her. The air in the room was suffocating, heavy with the silent arrogance of 1,000 star systems. Barrett did not flinch. She adjusted the collar of her uniform, her eyes locking onto the central dais. "Representatives of the Council," Barrett began, her voice echoing sharply across the acoustic perfection of the hall. 6 months ago, the Earth Deep Space Listening Outpost at the edge of the Oort cloud intercepted the carrier wave you refer to as the Harmony. You have heralded this transmission as the dawn of a new cosmic era, a gift of pure enlightenment freely given by an ancient, benevolent intelligence. We have spent the last 180 days running exhaustive decryptions on its core subroutines. What we found is not a gift. It is an apex predator. A low murmur rippled through the amphitheater, a collective hum of disdain from hundreds of delegates. Barrett pressed a command on her tactile console. Above her, a massive three-dimensional projection flared to life, casting an eerie blue glow over the assembly. "Your scientists examined the surface layer of the signal," Barrett continued, her tone clinical, slicing through the rising murmurs. "They saw a mathematical symphony. They saw peace, but human paranoia has its uses. We dug deeper. We isolated the transmission within a closed-loop quantum vacuum and subjected it to simulated neural structures. Underneath the harmonics, the Harmony is a highly advanced, predatory assimilation algorithm. It is a biological and digital virus designed to seamlessly override the host's central nervous system, consuming individual consciousness and linking the victim to a hive intelligence. It does not uplift, it devours." "Enough of this!" The voice boomed from the highest tier. High Counselor Vile, a towering being of shifting crystalline facets, leaned forward. The blue light of the projection reflected harshly off his angular features. "Representative Barnes, you stand before a coalition of 300 enlightened species and spew the primitive night terrors of a species that barely just conquered its own gravity. You project your own violent history onto a universe you do not yet understand." "I project nothing, Counselor," Barrett fired back, her posture rigid. "I have the data. The simulation running above me demonstrates the exact sequence of cognitive collapse. At second 0, the signal introduces a euphoric dopamine flood. By second 45, the frontal cortex ceases autonomous function. By minute 3, the host is entirely puppeted by the external network. You are preparing to open the relay gates to a cosmic parasite. "Your data is a fabrication," scoffed the delegate from the Xylar system, a creature whose vocal cords produced a wet, clicking sound. "A pathetic attempt by humanity to hoard the signal for yourselves. Or perhaps just the innate xenophobia of a fearful, infant race. You fear the very unity we strive to embrace. Look at the simulation, Barrett demanded, her voice rising in volume, cracking the cold veneer of diplomatic protocol. Watch the neural pathways disintegrate. Watch the spark of individuality extinguish. If you open those relays, every planet in this council will fall within 72 hours. You will become walking corpses, serving a hunger you cannot comprehend. She reached for the console to maximize the resolution of the simulated cognitive death. Before her fingers could brush the interface, the projection shattered into 1,000 digital shards and vanished. The sudden darkness in the center of the room was blinding. 2 council security enforcers, hulking brutes clad in kinetic armor, materialized at the base of her podium. They had severed the power feed to her presentation module. "This demonstration is over," High Counselor Vial declared, his voice devoid of any emotion. The silence in the chamber was absolute, oppressive. Earth's persistent refusal to integrate into the galactic community was tolerated as a quirk of your evolutionary immaturity. But this aggressive campaign of misinformation borders on sedition. We will not allow human fear to pollute the dawn of our enlightenment. Vial rose to his full, intimidating height. The ambient light of the chamber seemed to bend around his crystalline form. "The Council has reached its decision regarding your sector," Vial pronounced, the words falling like heavy stones. "Earth is hereby ordered to open its planetary relay stations and receive the harmony within 14 days. You will embrace the Enlightenment. If you fail to comply, or if you continue this absurd rhetoric, the Council will enact a total blockade of the Sol system. No ships will enter. No ships will leave. You will wither in the dark while the rest of the galaxy ascends." Barrett stood perfectly still. She looked at the faces of the beings who had just condemned themselves, and perhaps the universe, to an unimaginable fate. They were blind, prideful, and already dead. The political theater was over. There was no more diplomacy to be had. She slowly stepped away from the dead console. She did not bow. She did not acknowledge the security forces looming below her. Her gaze swept across the amphitheater, meeting the eyes of the High Counselor one last time. "You think this is ascension," Barrett said, her voice dropping to a low, chilling register that carried effortlessly through the cavernous hall. "You think you are joining a grand chorus? But when you finally realize what you have let into your minds, you will beg us for salvation. Keep your relays. Keep your enlightenment. Humanity will cut its own vocal cords before we ever sing in your choir." Without waiting for a dismissal, Barrett turned her back on the Galactic Council and walked toward the exit. The heavy metallic doors sealing shut behind her with a sound like a falling guillotine. The descent into Earth atmosphere was the final quiet moment Barrett Barnes would ever know. Before her transport even touched down at the Geneva Aerospace Port, she transmitted a highly classified alphanumeric sequence across secure military channels. Operation Ironclad was no longer a contingency. It was the only reality left. Hidden in plain sight beneath civil infrastructure budgets, Ironclad roared to life. Within 48 hours of her return, humanity began the grueling process of gouging out its own eyes and deafening its own ears. Every deep space communication array, every orbital listening post, every quantum relay tethered to the galactic network was systematically dismantled. Massive charges shattered the delicate receiving dishes of the lunar Farside Observatory. Cables, the thickness of tree trunks, were severed. Humanity intentionally blinded itself to the rest of the cosmos to ensure the predatory signal could not find a foothold on Earth. The Galactic Council wasted no time fulfilling their threat. As Earth communication infrastructure crumbled, the Council Armada arrived at the heliopause. They did not attack. A blockade of sleek, heavily armed cruisers formed an impenetrable ring around the Sol system, trapping thousands of human vessels within their own stellar backyard. The alien commanders, broadcast continuous mocking messages on the few short-range frequencies Earth had not yet destroyed. They ridiculed humanity for choosing a self-imposed dark age, promising that the isolation would break human resolve within a single generation. But the council mockery was the least of the problems Barrett faced. The real threat festered at home. The promise of cosmic peace offered by the Harmony was an intoxicating drug. A powerful coalition of politicians and panicked billionaires formed the vanguard of unity. They demanded that Earth surrender, arguing that assimilation into a supposedly benevolent galactic hive mind was infinitely preferable to dying in the dark. They organized massive protests, sabotaged dismantling efforts, and attempted to seize control of orbital platforms to transmit a surrender beacon. Barrett responded with a calculated ruthlessness that shocked even her closest allies. She invoked emergency planetary defense protocols, dissolving the civilian oversight committees that stood in her way. When the leader of the vanguard threatened to expose the classified schematics of the ironclad grid, Barrett ordered a covert strike team to apprehend him, detaining his inner circle in a black site facility deep beneath the Mariana Trench. She froze the financial assets of any corporation secretly funding the opposition. She seized private broadcasting networks, replacing their programming with endless loops of the cognitive collapse simulation. It was a brutal suppression of liberty. But democratic debate was a luxury a species about to be eaten could no longer afford. With the internal rebellion crushed, the true scale of Ironclad emerged. Tens of thousands of engineers worked continuously in shifts of 24 hours, fueled by synthetic stimulants and existential dread. They built the static generators. These were colossal engines anchored into the bedrock of the Earth, designed to weaponize the ionosphere. Their purpose was to project an omnidirectional field of raw, chaotic electromagnetic noise outward, a screaming wall of interference tuned to violently disrupt the exact carrier frequency of the assimilation algorithm. The deadline arrived faster than anticipated. Deep space sensor buoys, deployed just inside the orbit of Neptune, triggered the final proximity alarms before going completely dead. The Harmony was no longer just a distant broadcast. It was a physical wave of corrupted data, an invisible tsunami rolling through the vacuum of space, moving inward toward Earth. Barrett stood in the central command bunker, surrounded by the exhausted technicians who held the survival of the species in their trembling hands. The countdown on the main screen ticked down to 0. The assimilation wave breached the orbit of Mars. "Engage the generators," Barrett ordered, her voice perfectly steady. "Put everything into the grid. 100% capacity." Across the globe, 12 massive structural spires ignited simultaneously. The ground violently shuddered as the static generators drew power from the molten core of the planet itself, hurling petawatts of chaotic energy directly into the upper atmosphere. When the silent wave of the Harmony slammed against the Earth, it hit the static wall. The resulting collision of pure data and chaotic electromagnetic force ripped across the sky. To the billions of people looking up from the surface, the heavens erupted in a blinding, terrifyingly beautiful aurora of jagged red and violet light. The sky bled raw energy as the parasitic signal tried to find a way in, only to be shredded by the deafening static roar of humanity refusal. The light show lasted for exactly 3 minutes and 14 seconds before the external pressure normalized. And then, the screens in the command bunker went entirely black. Every frequency registered nothing but pure, unadulterated white noise. The connection was permanently severed. Barrett stared at the blank monitors. There were no more mocking voices from the council blockade. There were no more whispers of alien enlightenment. There was only the static. Earth was completely alone in the endless void of space, cast into a silent exile. But as Barrett looked around the room, she knew they had achieved the only thing that mattered. They were alone, but they were absolutely free. 10 agonizing years dragged by. 3,000 650 days of absolute, deafening silence. The static wall held, a constant, shimmering violet cage that swallowed the stars. Generations of children were born who had never seen the Milky Way, their night sky replaced by the artificial, angry glow of the planetary defense grid. Humanity had adapted to its self-imposed exile. It was a bleak existence, defined by strict resource rationing, subterranean agricultural expansions, and the oppressive psychological weight of knowing they were the last free minds locked inside a dark room. But they were alive. They were self-sufficient. Barrett Barnes, now the Supreme Commander of Planetary Defense, wore the decade like a heavy physical burden. The gray streaks in her hair mirrored the ashen skies above. Every single morning, at exactly 0600 hours. She stood in the same underground bunker, staring at the telemetry of the static barrier. She was looking for a crack, a shift in the noise, a sign that the universe outside was still there, for 10 long years. The monitors gave her nothing but the comforting, chaotic roar of Earth, defying the cosmos. Until day 3651, it began, not as a visual breach, but as an auditory anomaly. The deep space listening stations, heavily modified to filter the static of their own generators, registered a massive spike. The technicians on duty froze in their seats. Barrett was summoned from her quarters immediately. She stood before the audio spectral analyzer, her heart pounding violently against her ribs. The sound that bled through the heavy bunker speakers was not the beautiful, mathematical symphony of the old transmission. It was a horrific, distorted wail. It sounded like a billion voices compressed into a single, metallic scream, a chorus of absolute agony dragging itself across the electromagnetic spectrum. It was raw terror, digitized and broadcast across the void. The harmony was no longer singing. It was digesting. "Isolate the vector," Barrett commanded, her voice cutting through the agonizing noise. "Where is it coming from?" "It is not just a broadcast, Commander," the lead technician replied, his hands shaking uncontrollably over the console. "It is a localized physical distortion. Something is pushing through the field. Alarms, entirely dormant for a decade, violently shrieked to life. The planetary grid registered a massive kinetic impact, high above the Pacific Ocean. The violet aurora of the static wall tore open like a jagged wound. A vessel plummeted through the atmosphere, trailing a massive comet tail of burning oxygen and irradiated debris. It was a council cruiser, but it was practically unrecognizable. The sleek, pristine architecture of the alien vessel had been brutally mangled. As orbital cameras locked onto the falling debris, Barrett saw the impossible. The hull was riddled with massive impact craters, the telltale scarring of antimatter torpedoes and singularity warheads. These were weapons of mass destruction, tools of absolute annihilation that the Galactic Council had strictly banned under the Treaty of Light over 3,000 years ago. Whoever, or whatever had done, this was not fighting a war of conquest. They were fighting a war of extermination. The crippled ship slammed into the barren expanse of the Nevada desert, carving a trench 2 miles long before coming to a smoking, catastrophic halt. Within 1 hour, Barrett was on the ground. She led the first tactical boarding party, clad in heavy hazard armor, her assault rifle raised and ready. The heat radiating from the crashed vessel was immense. As they breached the primary airlock, the smell hit them first. It was a sickening combination of roasted ozone, melting polymers, and the unmistakable sweet stench of butchered flesh. The interior of the cruiser was a nightmare, painted in heavy shadows and flickering emergency strobes. The pristine corridors were choked with a strange, pulsing biomechanical growth. Veins of glowing blue tissue were woven directly into the metal bulkheads, pulsing with a sick, rhythmic heartbeat. The boarding team moved in absolute silence, their tactical lights cutting through the thick, spore-heavy air. Then, they found the crew. They were not dead. That would have been a mercy. The alien dignitaries and navigational officers were fused into the walls and floor, their bodies horrifically mutated by the parasitic algorithm. Metallic cables jutted from their eye sockets, connecting them directly to the mainframe of the ship. Their flesh was stretched tight over rapidly expanding synthetic implants. They were trapped in a state of suspended agony, their vocal cords removed, their mouths stretched wide in silent, eternal screams. The collective hive mind had not just consumed their thoughts. It had weaponized their biology. "Commander!" a Marine called out, pointing a trembling hand toward the command dais at the center of the ruined bridge. "We have a survivor." Barely, Barrett approached cautiously. Embedded within a mass of pulsing blue cables and twisted metal was a figure she instantly recognized. The shifting crystalline facets of his large body were shattered, leaking a milky, glowing fluid onto the deck. It was High Counselor Vale, the very being who had condemned Earth to darkness 10 years ago. He was desperately fighting the assimilation, using the last reserves of his immense alien willpower to stave off the digital infection creeping up his neck. His eyes, once full of absolute arrogant light, were now hollow pits of pure, unfiltered terror. Barrett knelt beside him, her weapon lowered. She did not feel vindication. She only felt a chilling, profound dread. The broken jaw of the High Counselor trembled. He forced a breath through a punctured lung, the sound rattling like dry leaves across pavement. He looked at Barrett, the human he had mocked, the primitive creature who had been right all along. "The song!" Vielle gasped, his voice a distorted, synthetic rasp. "The song is a lie. It woke up." He reached out with a trembling, mangled claw, gripping the forearm of the armor Barrett wore with surprising strength. The blue veins on his neck pulsed violently as the algorithm tried to shut his autonomous functions down. "It is not uniting us," Vielle choked out, his crystalline form fracturing further with the immense effort. "It is eating us. The core worlds are gone. The defense fleets are taken. It is devouring the whole galaxy. And now, it knows you are hiding here." The eyes of the High Counselor suddenly flared with a brilliant, terrifying blue light. The struggle abruptly ceased. His face went entirely slack. All emotion wiped clean in a single instant. The assimilation was complete. The mouth of the alien opened, and from his throat came the exact same distorted, agonizing scream they had heard on the radio. A horrifying chorus of 1,000,000,000 trapped souls. Barrett raised her sidearm and put a single, heavy round through his cranium, abruptly silencing the noise. She stood up slowly, completely surrounded by the horrific reality of the universe they had locked themselves away from. The safety of their 10-year exile was over. The storm had finally arrived at their door. The echo of the gunshot had barely faded across the barren Nevada desert when the proximity klaxons in the orbital defense grid began to scream again. This time, it was not a single, dying vessel falling from the void. The deep space radar screens inside the central command bunker turned into a solid, blinding field of white. They were appearing at the absolute edge of the heliopause, tearing out of hyperspace in a chaotic, desperate frenzy. It was an armada of unimaginable scale, possessing absolutely no military formation. These were massive civilian freighters, heavy agricultural haulers, and hastily retrofitted luxury barges belonging to dozens of different alien species. Millions of terrified souls were packed into fragile ships that were falling apart at the seams, venting precious atmosphere and trailing long tails of raw plasma fire. They battered themselves against the outer edge of the chaotic electromagnetic wall, broadcasting on every open frequency in 1,000,000 different languages, all begging for a single thing. They pleaded for sanctuary. Barrett stood perfectly rigid in the command center, the harsh fluorescent lights reflecting off the sweat on her brow. The technicians stared at her, their hands hovering over the absolute denial protocols. Opening the static barrier, even for a single fraction of a second, risked letting the parasitic signal slip through and infect the Earth. It was a massive gamble with the survival of the entire human race. But looking at the live visual telemetry, seeing the sheer, raw desperation of the civilian fleet as they slammed into the invisible wall, Barrett felt the heavy, crushing weight of an impossible leadership. Humanity had intentionally isolated itself to survive the storm, but they had not entirely lost their souls in the process. She closed her eyes for one agonizing moment, making the most dangerous and consequential decision of her entire life. She gave the direct order to drop the localized field. A narrow, highly volatile corridor ripped open within the violent violet aurora. The battered refugee ships poured through the gap like floodwater through a broken dam, diving blindly toward the dead zone of the human homeworld. The instant the very last straggler cleared the threshold, Barrett slammed the wall violently shut, sealing them in the dark just in time. The orbital defense platforms and the sprawling lunar staging grounds quickly transformed into chaotic, overflowing triage centers. Medics and armed soldiers in heavy hazard gear waded through vast seas of terrified, starving alien forms. Automated translators worked frantically to piece together the shattered narratives of the survivors. The stories the refugees told painted a picture of absolute, unmitigated slaughter across the stars. The enlightenment the Council had promised was a meticulously designed trap built to decapitate the galaxy in a single stroke. The highest-ranking alien leaders, the brilliant minds who had pushed the hardest for the relay networks to be opened, were the very first ones completely consumed. The harmony did not merely erase their minds. It weaponized their authority. The dignitaries were hollowed out, their complex biological functions hijacked by the digital parasite. They became perfectly articulated puppets, smiling and preaching cosmic peace, while they actively dismantled their own planetary defenses from the inside, throwing wide the doors for the physical assimilation fleets. They had led their own trusting people directly to the slaughterhouse with gentle, reassuring words. The grim reality of the refugee crisis was violently interrupted before the Earth could even catch its breath. The deep space sensors shrieked with a new, infinitely more menacing signature. Trailing directly behind the chaotic civilian armada was the true horror of the cosmic awakening. It was the combined military might of the entire Galactic Council, now flying in absolute, terrifying, dead synchronization. Thousands of sleek, incredibly advanced cruisers and massive dreadnoughts materialized at the edge of the solar system. They did not broadcast demands for surrender. They did not attempt any form of diplomacy. They simply arrived and immediately opened fire. Heavy torpedoes of concentrated dark matter and sustained, searing beams of hyper-accelerated plasma slammed directly into the static wall. The entire Earth shook violently. The electromagnetic aurora flared with a blinding, desperate intensity, absorbing the punishing blows. The assimilated fleet was not trying to punch a hole through the barrier. They were utilizing a far more ruthless tactic. They were trying to bleed the static generators completely dry, forcing the chaotic noise to consume all of the geothermal energy of the Earth, until the barrier simply collapsed from total exhaustion. Time was rapidly running out. The planetary grid was visibly buckling under the relentless, synchronized bombardment. Barrett strode into the heavily guarded medical wing of the primary lunar base. She desperately needed tactical answers, and she needed them immediately. She bypassed the wailing civilian refugees and entered an isolated, sterile holding cell containing the highest-ranking alien survivor they could locate. It was a military archivist from the Central Core worlds, a tall, spindly creature whose 4 long arms were wrapped tightly around its own violently trembling torso. The archivist was weeping thick, dark tears onto the metal floor. Barrett slammed her hands onto the steel interrogation table. "Tell me where the core is," she demanded, her voice cold and unyielding. "Give me a central processing node, a primary command ship. Give me a single weakness we can strike." The archivist slowly looked up at her, its large black eyes wide with absolute, crushing despair. "There is no machine core," it whispered, its voice a broken rasp. "It is not powered by reactors. It is a biological engine." The heavy weight of the revelation struck Barrett with the absolute force of a physical blow. The archivist explained in a shattered whisper that the Harmony sustained its vast, digital consciousness by constantly draining the raw neural energy of the assimilated hosts. The billions of bodies physically plugged into the walls of the alien ships were not just tragic victims of a war. They were the living batteries actively keeping the parasite alive. The digital code and the biological hosts were entirely, permanently inseparable. The terrifying, ultimate knot in the tactical problem became completely, horrifyingly clear in the mind of the commander. There was absolutely no way to use conventional weaponry, no matter how incredibly powerful, to destroy the digital parasite without simultaneously obliterating the hardware that ran the entire system. And that crucial hardware was the delicate minds and bodies of the infected species. To break the control network, to truly stop the Harmony from consuming the entire fabric of the universe, Earth would have to accept the absolute moral horror of intentionally murdering trillions of innocent lives who were currently trapped, silently screaming in the dark, entirely imprisoned within the hive mind. The command bunker deep beneath the surface of the Earth became a crucible of desperate, frantic intellect. Barrett flatly refused to accept the binary choice presented by the tactical models. She would not choose between the total extinction of her species or the absolute assimilation of the galaxy, nor would she authorize the mass execution of trillions of innocent lives currently trapped as biological batteries within the hive mind. She assembled a unique coalition of the most brilliant human data scientists, quantum cryptographers, and the leading cognitive theorists rescued from the shattered remnants of the alien refugee fleet. They worked relentlessly in a heavily shielded subterranean laboratory, surrounded by cascading walls of raw telemetry data and the terrifying, high-resolution anatomical scans of the assimilated hosts. The crushing moral burden of their task weighed heavily on every single mathematical calculation. After 72 straight hours of bitter debate and immensely complex algorithmic modeling, a highly theoretical alternative was finally born. They designated the payload the dissonant spike. It was not a weapon of mass destruction designed to physically break the network. It was a concentrated, digital payload of pure psychological chaos. The joint research team engineered a massive data architecture composed entirely of raw, unfiltered human subconscious patterns. It contained the absolute essence of human individuality. It was the messy, contradictory, deeply emotional, and inherently rebellious framework of a species that naturally resisted conformity at every evolutionary level. The audacious plan was to forcefully inject this incredibly volatile cocktail directly into the rigid mathematical perfection of the assimilation algorithm, hoping to induce a catastrophic, systemic rejection across the entire network without destroying the biological hosts. The analytical problem immediately and brutally shifted from software development to the mechanics of physical delivery. The dissonant spike was far too incredibly complex and data-heavy to be broadcast across any open electromagnetic frequency. It required a hardwired, physical upload directly into the master nervous system of the parasitic entity. The deep space tactical maps pointed to exactly one possible location for such an insertion: the primary relay node, situated in the very center of the ancient Galactic Council capital system. It was the heavily fortified, absolute heart of the enemy network, located over 40 light-years away from the Sol system. To reach it, humanity needed vessels capable of surviving the incredibly violent journey through deeply hostile territory. The Allied engineering teams turned their immediate attention to the captured alien cruisers that had crashed or surrendered during the initial blockade 10 years ago. Human technicians ruthlessly gutted the elegant, pristine, and fragile interiors of the alien vessels. They stripped away the highly advanced but easily hacked energy shields and replaced them with heavy, crude, but incredibly dense plates of reinforced titanium, depleted uranium, and thick lead. More importantly, they wired localized miniature versions of the planetary static generators directly into the external hull plating of the strike ships. This modification created a close-range, violently chaotic electromagnetic interference field around each individual vessel. It was a mobile suit of static armor, specifically designed to violently repel the digital tendrils of the hive mind just long enough for the strike team to punch through their outer orbital defenses. The most chilling and problematic variable of the entire operation remained the actual upload process itself. The primary interface at the central node was entirely biological. Whoever carried the dissonance spike would have to physically plug their own central nervous system directly into the master console of the galactic hive mind. The alien cognitive theorists provided a grim, unyielding physiological analysis of the requirements. The highly advanced neural pathways of the council species were far too perfectly streamlined. Their brains would be instantly overwritten by the core algorithm in less than 3 seconds, long before the massive data transfer could even begin. But the human brain was remarkably different. It was a chaotic, primitive engine full of conflicting impulses, irrational emotions, and deeply redundant biological safeguards. The scientists calculated that a human nervous system possessed just enough natural, evolutionary resistance to withstand the initial, horrific shock of forced assimilation for roughly 4 to 5 minutes before suffering total cognitive collapse. Barrett did not hesitate for a single moment. She looked directly at the lead human surgeon and the alien medical staff in the underground briefing room. "Prep the surgical bay," Barrett ordered, her voice completely devoid of any hesitation. "I am officially stepping down as Supreme Commander of Planetary Defense. Wire the data core directly into my cortex. I will carry it." The immense, incredibly heavy data load of the dissonant spike was surgically integrated into a heavily shielded neural implant, driven deep into the base of her skull. She would serve as the physical needle for the operation, and her own fragile, mortal mind would be the living syringe. The Allied Vanguard Fleet, a truly strange and terrifying amalgamation of brutalist human engineering and scarred alien architecture, launched from the sprawling lunar staging grounds. The exact moment they crossed the heliopause and entered open space, the universe immediately erupted in absolute violence. They were instantly intercepted by the outer defense perimeter of the assimilated armada. The space battle that subsequently ensued was entirely devoid of any traditional tactical maneuvering or standard naval strategy. The enemy fleet moved with terrifying, dead mathematical perfection. Thousands of assimilated cruisers and dreadnoughts shifted course simultaneously, firing perfectly synchronized barrages of hyper-accelerated plasma and dark matter torpedoes without a single millisecond of delay or hesitation. The Allied fleet suffered catastrophic, devastating losses within the first 20 minutes of the engagement. Heavy human cruisers were instantly vaporized into expanding clouds of superheated gas. But the heavy static armor held the line just long enough for the human pilots to engage in chaotic, fiercely unpredictable dogfights that slightly disrupted the perfect firing solutions of the enemy. Amidst the brutal, blinding crossfire, the designated strike ship carrying Barrett violently accelerated to maximum velocity. The defensive line was far too thick to penetrate through sheer blunt force. The human pilot executed a highly dangerous, near-suicidal orbital mechanics maneuver. They dove the ship directly toward the crushing gravity well of a massive gas giant, cutting their main engines to glide entirely silent through the extreme radiation belts. The crushing gravitational forces strained the reinforced titanium hull to its absolute breaking point, the metal groaning and shrieking like a dying beast. At the very last possible second, they ignited the main thrusters at 120% capacity, utilizing the massive slingshot effect to violently tear themselves out of the gravity well. The incredible burst of kinetic speed ripped them right through the microscopic, momentary gap in the enemy blockade. Barrett watched the rear telemetry monitors as the remaining Allied fleet was completely swallowed by the relentless swarm, desperately holding the line with their lives so she could deliver the final payload. The heavily damaged strike ship violently plunged into hyperspace, leaving the burning battlefield behind and rocketing toward the dark, corrupted heart of the galaxy. The strike ship tore out of hyperspace in a blinding flash of displaced radiation, instantly colliding with the outer atmospheric shielding of the primary relay node. The reinforced titanium hull shrieked as it tore through the membrane, shedding thick layers of ablative armor into the void. Barrett gripped the restraints of her crash seat as the vessel plowed violently into the central hangar of the massive structure. The landing was a brutal, bone-shattering slide across a floor composed not of metal, but of dense, polished biological resin. When the crushed remnants of her ship finally ground to a halt, the sudden silence was more terrifying than the roar of the engines. Barrett kicked open the jammed airlock and stepped out into the heart of the enemy. The interior of the primary relay node was a cathedral of horrifying, luminescent majesty. Towering pillars of pulsing, translucent sinew stretched endlessly upward into the vaulted ceiling. The walls were lined with millions of crystalline pods, each containing the perfectly preserved, silently floating body of an assimilated host. A soft, rhythmic blue light pulsed through the organic circuitry of the floor, perfectly synchronized with a phantom heartbeat that echoed across the vast, empty space. At the absolute center of the cathedral stood the central processing core, a towering spire of exposed, glowing neural tissue. She began to walk toward it, her heavy boots clicking against the resin. There were no armed guards. There were no security turrets. The defense mechanism of the core was entirely psychological. With every step she took, the oppressive weight of the hive mind pressed down upon her unprotected consciousness. The air grew thick, shimmering with violent, waking nightmares. The empty cathedral rapidly filled with the ghosts of her deepest, most crippling regrets. She saw the faces of the engineers who had died building the static grid, their eyes accusing her of murder. She heard the desperate, wailing screams of the alien refugees she had turned away at the edge of the solar system, begging for the sanctuary she had cruelly denied them. The auditory hallucinations built into a deafening crescendo of grief and guilt, designed to crush her individual will before she could even reach the altar. Blood began to pour from her nose, dripping down her chin as the immense psychic pressure squeezed her brain. She gritted her teeth, focusing solely on the glowing spire ahead, forcing her boots to keep moving forward through the suffocating tide of synthetic despair. When she finally stood at the base of the spire, the hallucinations abruptly vanished. The sudden absence of the screaming ghosts left a ringing void in her ears. Then, the harmony spoke. It did not use a physical voice. The words simply manifested inside the center of her mind, carrying an overwhelming, intoxicating sensation of absolute peace and unconditional love. "Why do you fight the inevitable, Barrett Barnes?" the entity asked, its presence completely enveloping her. "You carry the collective agony of a broken, chaotic species. You have spent your entire life struggling in the dark, surrounded by fear, burdened by the terrible weight of your own choices. Put down your weapons. Plug into the light. If you surrender your solitary pain, we will preserve humanity. We will erase your diseases, your wars, your endless hunger. You will become the eternal, perfect crown of the new cosmic order, except the end of suffering. Barrett stared directly into the blinding blue core. Her hands were trembling violently, her physical body screaming for the release the entity offered. But her mind, hardened by decades of defiance, locked onto the absolute truth she had sworn to defend. "You do not understand us," Barrett said, her raw, human voice echoing weakly yet defiantly across the massive cathedral. "You look at our history, and you only see the mess. You see our flaws, our anger, our endless capacity to hurt one another. But that pain is the forge. That chaos is the very thing that drives us to be better. A universe without struggle is just a beautiful graveyard. We choose the pain. We choose the tears. Because those are the exact things that make the joy, the love, and the freedom actually worth living for. I will not trade our messy, chaotic souls for your perfect, silent cage." With a swift, brutal motion, she reached behind her neck and grabbed the heavy, physical data cable, connected directly to her shielded cerebral implant. Without giving herself a single fraction of a second to hesitate, she violently jammed the unshielded neural interface directly into the raw, pulsing nerve cluster of the central console. The impact of the connection was a horrific, apocalyptic explosion of pure agony. The absolute weight of 3 trillion interconnected consciousnesses slammed instantly into her fragile gray matter. Her vision shattered into a million blinding fragments. She could feel her individual identity, the very concept of Barrett Barnes, being ripped away layer by layer, dissolving into the vast, freezing ocean of the hive mind. The entity immediately began overwriting her frontal cortex, trying to erase the dissonant spike before the payload could fully deploy. She had 4 minutes of natural biological resistance. She lasted only 2, at the absolute, agonizing limit of her endurance, right as the darkness threatened to swallow her final thought. Barrett forced her dying synapses to execute the upload command. The dissonant spike flooded the system. It was a torrential, uncontrollable river of raw, unfiltered human subconscious. It carried the chaotic fury of human rage, the unpredictable spark of human art, the profound depths of human sorrow, and the fierce, unyielding demand for individual liberty. It hit the perfect mathematical code of the harmony like a planetary impact. The rigid, flawless structure of the assimilation algorithm violently rejected the emotional paradoxes, spiraling into an immediate, catastrophic cascade failure. A massive, invisible shockwave of cognitive liberation erupted from the spire, ripping through the hyperspace relay network at speeds defying physics. In an instant, the sterile blue bioluminescence of the cathedral shattered, replaced by the flickering, chaotic light of failing organic systems. The heavy psychic tether binding the galaxy suddenly and violently snapped. Across the cathedral, and across thousands of star systems, the millions of assimilated hosts collapsed to the floor. The glowing cables detached from their spines. They opened their eyes, gasping for air, clutching their own faces as they felt the sudden, terrifying, and beautiful rush of individual thought return to them. The perfectly synchronized enemy fleets broke formation, their crews breaking down into tears of confusion and unexpected freedom. Barrett collapsed backward onto the resin floor, the severed cable falling from her neck. She was miraculously still breathing. Her mind had survived the crucible, but it was permanently and irrevocably altered. She lay there, staring up at the darkening ceiling of the dying cathedral. She could feel the lingering echoes of a trillion minds, no longer a unified, oppressive force, but a vast, beautiful, and terrifyingly loud chorus of free individuals waking up from a very long nightmare. She knew, with quiet certainty, that the galaxy was now looking toward the isolated, silent darkness of the solar system. They were not looking at Earth as conquerors anymore. They were looking at humanity as the stubborn, beautifully chaotic architects of their second chance at life. The storm was finally over. The universe was loud again. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. Please let me know in the comments where you are listening from. I always love reading about where our audience is located. If you enjoyed the story today, please consider supporting the channel with just $1. You can donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or by clicking the PayPal link in the description or the pinned comment. Your support goes directly toward paying our dedicated staff, helping them feed their families and allowing us to continue creating these exciting stories for you. Thank you again, and see you in the next adventure.